Greetings sailors and welcome to my look at the USS Alabama, the upcoming Tier 8 South Dakota class premium American battleship. And it's only going to be the second Tier 8 premium battleship in the game as well, so considering it's up against the Tirpitz, it's got some fairly high standards to meet. Now, of course, there is also the Missouri, which is a Tier 9 premium, but that's basically an Iowa. Whereas this, well, it represents a slightly different class than the North Carolina. I say slightly different, it is a different class of ship. It's the South Dakotas are the ones that came after the North Carolinas design-wise. But you look at the stats and you think, okay, it probably doesn't play all that differently from a North Carolina, because the principal differences are way better torpedo bulge protection, less accuracy, it's got a worse sigma value, and it's also got slightly worse range. So you look at all this, you look at the fact that it turns like a Colorado, which is pretty good for a battleship with this speed, and you think, okay, that seems like a decent trade-off. You've lost some accuracy compared to the North Carolina, but you've gained some close-in torpedo protection and maneuverability, and so therefore you're going to want to get in close and brawl, like a more maneuverable Tirpitz. Only, of course, the Germans have got the turtleback armour over the Citadel, and the Citadel is really the issue with this ship. Now, at Tier 9 and 10, both the Iowa and the Montana currently have a Citadel that extends above the waterline, which gives them a lot of their reputation for fragility. That's being changed in, I think, the next patch, or an upcoming patch anyway. It's being lowered, so they will be, in theory, tougher, more survivable. The South Dakota, well, the Alabama, although I know it is a South Dakota, but you know, this represents a specific ship, so I suppose I should be specific about the name. Yeah, it has that above waterline Citadel. And so although you look at the stats and think it's not that different from the North Carolina, yeah, it is, because the North Carolina Citadel is flush with the waterline. Now, this particular first clip, this is just the worst of everything, all in the space of like 2 minutes. So this was a Tier 10 game, and I was trying to rely on the stealth of this thing, and okay, well, no, I got spotted, and I've taken a bit of damage, but okay, it's not good, but if I can get in towards the island, I'll be fine. Now, the whole thing was me seeing a Yamato getting shot at by a Yamato and just panicking a bit. There's actually an island to my left that it would have been a lot safer to go to. But the problems are compounded by the fact that this Prince Eugen decides to rush me. And there we go. Yeah, even at that angle, the Yamato, it's just going to lol pen you. There's no way around it. So, yeah, okay, that's not good. Okay, there's that above waterline Citadel just getting me incredibly screwed. But I'm still alive. Now, of course, I've already put out one lot of shots against this Prince Eugen, 3 over pens and the other 3 splashed into the water. So I wait for him to make the turn, thinking at this range I can't possibly miss. No, it's a penetration and another over pen. So, yeah, there is both the weakness of the armour and the sometimes extreme wonkiness of the guns, all in a very nasty little nutshell. And this was my second game in this thing, which did not produce a great first impression, I have to say. So that Eugen should have been punished so hard for just, like, he threw his ship away to do that. That was a pure suicidal move. But because the Sigma in particular decided to troll me so hard there, you know, the first salvo at less than 6 kilometers, 3 over pens, and then 3 that splashed into the water. So they fell short enough that they just, you know, didn't even go into the water and pen below the waterline or anything. No, it was just straight up the sea ate my shells. And then that second salvo was almost worse, even though it did more damage because it was so much closer. 2.7 kilometers, 1 penetration, 1 over pen. And the other 4 shells did nothing. So yeah, I kind of wanted my money back on that. So that first clip there, you know, it's not always going to be like that, but just within the very second game, I experienced the worst aspects of this ship all in one go. And against high-tier ships, high-tier battleships, especially the Yamato, this thing feels basically like a cruiser. And if you show any amount of broadside to other battleships and they happen to be looking your way, yeah, it's like you're sailing around in a New Orleans or a Megami rather than this thing. So it is by far, despite the stats, the most fragile of the Tier 8 battleships, and it almost feels like you're playing a slower Dunkirk, to be quite honest. So having given that assessment of its capabilities, I think at this point break down the stats in a bit more detail, and we'll look at the actual armor layout towards the end of the video. Now, I've got two more or less full replays for you. I've made a few edits here and there, but you'll get some idea of what this thing is like when you're not having the ever-living hell trolled out of you by RNGs and Yamatos. And it's okay. I'm not going to say it's anything like as good as the Tirpitz, but the Tirpitz is quite a high bar to pass. But it's okay. It's hard to get excited about this ship. I know it will mean something to a lot of my US viewers because it's preserved as a museum ship and you can actually go and visit it. But it's hard to say that it's especially wonderful given the games that I've played in it. So we'll start off with hit points. You've got 63,300, which is the least at Tier 8 for a battleship. The Amagi and the North Carolina are both around 66,000. Bismarck and Tirpitz both are around 69,000. So 63,000 compared to 66,000, not that big a gap, but then you look at the Germans with their like 6k more health. Yeah, you know, it's like one or two more hits. But when you consider the amount of citadel damage this thing can take, even if it was 69,000, it could still melt away pretty damn quickly. So the hit points doesn't matter that much overall. The fact that it has the least, it's not the least by a huge amount. Torpedo protection, on the other hand, is by far the best. It even surpasses the Amagi's 43%. It's got a whopping 49%. Now, the Amagi has a bigger belt. It covers more of the ship, but it gives a little bit less protection. So that mitigation, especially compared to the 19% and the 22% of the Germans, the 19% of the North Carolina, I should say, that's quite significant. And so those occasions when you do need to take a torpedo, you want to take it in the belt if at all possible. And there's actually a bit in the next replay where I angle myself because I know I'm probably not going to be able to dodge. I angle myself so I take it in the belt at least rather than on the nose, and that almost certainly saved me a few thousand damage. The armor, well, we'll go to that at the end, but nominally the values aren't too bad. It's just the raised citadel that is extremely problematic, but otherwise it's not so far off in values from the North Carolina. So if it didn't have that above waterline citadel, it would actually be somewhat tanky, I think. Guns, well, you've got the exact same guns as the North Carolina, as in literally the exact same guns, the same specification, the same mark. I don't know what you'd say there exactly, but yes, it uses the same guns and the same shells, so the performance is broadly similar, although there are some differences. So as with the NC, you've got that two forward turrets and one aft arrangement. The aft firing angles aren't that good, to be quite honest. A lot of the time it's sort of like the IO, where you're just going to have to pretend that that aft turret doesn't exist and not take the risk of exposing yourself to use it, because a lot of the time it's not going to be worth the risk. So having a third of your firepower be unavailable a lot of the time is kind of annoying, but it's not the only ship that suffers from that. Reloads 30 seconds, which is pretty standard. Turret turn is actually marginally better than North Carolina. It has 40 seconds, which is that's not bad. It's about halfway between the North Carolina and the Bismarck, so it's not quite as good as the Germans, but 40 seconds is pretty respectable. It does feel like you can keep your turrets on target relatively easily, and this is one of those battleships where you don't really need a captain in it that has expert marksman. I mean, yes, it will help, but the turret turn time is already good enough that you can easily get away without it. Range 21.1 kilometers, so just around that of the Bismarck. You can use the plotting room to actually increase that, but I don't think there's any point, to be honest. Dispersion is actually, I think, around about the same as North Carolina, but it's the sigma value that is worse. I've seen figures of either 1.8 or 1.9. Either way, it's worse than the 2.0 of the North Carolina. So 1.8 and 1.9 would kind of put it in the region of the Dunkirk. Think the Dunkirk's guns. It's around about that kind of level of accuracy. So you're going to get a lot of straddling shots with this thing, especially at range. Hell, even at close ranges, as we saw in that very first clip, even at 2.7 kilometers, you will still get shells that will just politely decline to go where you want them to, and then you subsequently die to a bunch of torpedoes that are lobbed your way by a suicidal cruiser. So yeah, even at close ranges, expect some trolliness from these guns, especially because, unlike say the mid-tier battleships where they have lower sigma but a lot more firepower, with this one, as I've said, that rear turret angle, you can't even get all of your own firepower on target a lot of the time. So it's a bit of a struggle on occasion to actually get the damage out. Your shells are identical to the North Carolina, so 13,100 for a Citadel, which is the best at tier 8. The HE's 5,700 with a fire chance of 36%, which again, best at tier 8. The velocities are a little odd though. The AP velocity is exactly the same. It's that usual slow American battleship AP shell, which is one of the things that counts against these ships generally, but the North Carolina at least has better accuracy. When you've got a slow shell and poor accuracy, it can make leading targets at anything other than closer ranges a bit tricky, but for some reason the HE shells are slower. They're about 20 meters a second slower than the North Carolina. They're the same HE shells, fired out the same guns, so I don't know why they're slower, but there it is. Secondaries, again, exactly the same as the North Carolina. You've got 10 twin mount 5-inch guns spread out all along your side, so you're going to have to angle a little bit to get them into play. They've also got the same 5-kilometer range, so yeah, it's okay. It's kind of average at this tier. You can buff that with captain skills and equipment if you so choose, but the secondaries are not particularly a strength of this ship, just as they're not particularly a strength of the North Carolina. They're there and they're useful, but they're relatively short range, and everything pales in comparison to the Bismarck, just with the number and the range of the secondaries it has. So there's not too much to complain about there. At least it doesn't kind of get hindered in the way that the Amagi does, with having a bunch of AP throwing secondaries, which aren't that much use at tier 8. AA, a little less good than the North Carolina, but still good enough to easily place it as second best at tier 8 for a battleship. The overall rating is 75 versus the 77 of the NC. The envelope follows more or less the same pattern as well, where you've got the outer part of your DPS provided by the dual purpose 5-inch guns. So the DPS is in fact exactly identical, and that means if you choose to put manual AA on this ship, you can get quite a good effect out of it, because it goes from like 151, something like that, without the benefit of BFT of course, or any equipment, to 300 when you're clicking on something. So double the effectiveness of those guns. So it, like the North Carolina, has very strong AA. The better part of the DPS is still at the mid-range, the 3.5 kilometer mark, but like I say, if you choose to put an AA American battleship captain in this, it can be very effective. Speed 27.5 knots, just like the North Carolina. It's quite comfortably fast. It's not as speedy as the Bismarck or the Amagi or the Tirpitz, of course, but if you've been crawling along in New Mexicos and Colorados for however many dozens of battles, then if you jump into something like this, it's quite a welcome change. It's fast enough, it has enough speed to work with. And considering the next stat, actually, that the speed is really quite good when you couple it, because the turn radius is 710 meters, and as I've mentioned, I think that's pretty much the same as the Colorado. So you've got the maneuverability plus the speed of a slow ship and a fast ship altogether, or a faster ship anyway. And that's a rare combination. So that's one of those things where it does feel like they want you to get in closer. Now, this is a shorter ship than the North Carolina, which is, I guess, partly why they've decided to make that turn radius nice and tight at 710 meters. And if only it didn't have an exposed citadel, you could really make some good use of that. It's still a battleship. It's maybe a little bit fat to torpedo beat at anything other than kind of medium to long ranges when the torpedoes have spread out a bit. But in theory, you could do it quite easily. And just the ability to turn, comparatively speaking, on a dime and dodge torpedoes at longer ranges when you know that people have been dropping torps against you. It's a really useful thing in a battleship, especially coupled with the very good torpedo protection that you've got. So that's one of the highlights of this ship, is that maneuverability that it has, the speed plus the tight turning circle. That's one of the nicer things that the Citadel only just manages to completely detract from. Lastly, detection ranges. With the premium camo that you get for free, it's got the same surface detection as an uncamouflaged North Carolina. So you can take it that it's worse by about 500 meters. Now I have to say, all of the Tier 8 battleships are actually reasonably stealthy if you care to make them so. Having made some comparisons to the Dunkirk earlier, you know, the Dunkirk's got the speed and it's got that forward turret arrangement, which this almost effectively does have sometimes, because you can only use those forward turrets quite a lot of the time. But the Dunkirk gets seen from space, and this doesn't. But none of the other Tier 8 battleships do especially either. The worst of the bunch by far is the Amagi, which nominally, without camo or anything, gets spotted at 17.3 kilometers. But with the investment in captain skills and a concealment module and camo, you can get that down to 12.6. 12.6 is pretty good, and as you can imagine, all the other Tier 8 battleships are better, because they all have better base detection ranges. In the case of the Alabama, well, you can get it down to, it's around about 11.9. And the North Carolina in comparison is around about 11.5. So when I say it's about 500 meters, I think it's actually a little less than 500 meters between them. But the client only gives us one decimal place to work with when it's talking about camo values. So there's a little bit of guesswork involved. But still, 11.8, 11.9, whatever it is, that's pretty good. And there are times when that's going to come in very useful. So I think with this ship in particular, considering its fragility, concealment module is a must. And if you can put a captain on it that has concealment expert as well, that's going to help you out a lot. It also makes the decision of when to put out fires a bit more tricky, because ordinarily in a battleship, if it's just, say, one fire, you want to let that burn. But there are some situations in this ship in particular where you might well want to extinguish a single fire, because, of course, while you're burning, you're visible from further away. It gives you an extra debuff to your concealment value. So bear that in mind. There are times when you're going to have to actually think, do I want to put this fire out and stealth up again because there's a nasty tier 10 battleship firing at me, as opposed to a Tirpitz where you would just let it burn and then heal the health back. The last bit of the detection is the air spotting, which is actually the best for its tier, 12.1 kilometers. So you're going to get spotted from the air just a little bit before you get spotted from the surface if you're fully stealthed. That's quite a nice combination, actually, because a lot of the other battleships, you can add a kilometer or more to their best possible surface concealment when it comes to the air spotting. So yeah, that's I think I found quite handy, that even if there are carriers around, they're going to spot you roughly around the same time, just a little bit earlier than you'd get spotted on the surface. So that's another, it's a minor benefit overall, but it's better to have it than not. So that's all the stats disposed of and the first game finished. This was, I think, the third match I had, so it was almost immediately after that second match, where I just got, lol penned by a Yamato and then trolled by my own guns and finally torpedoed by a suicidal Hipper. That game was a bit drawn out, and I think it was maybe a bit more drawn out than it needed to be. We actually won at the 20-minute mark on victory points, but we kind of rallied and came back, and although it was quite an awkward match in a lot of ways, the people that were surviving up till the end, generally speaking, did fairly well. And as you can see, I came out of it with a pretty decent result. 2.4k base XP and 600k profit. Profit-wise, it's a tier 8 premium battleship. It will make credits. It's not going to make as many as the Missouri, of course, but the Missouri you could see as being a much more expensive investment, because either you're going to pay a lot of gold for conversion, or you've got to spend a lot of time grinding free XP. So, comparatively speaking, this is still an okay investment. But if you just wanted a tier 8 battleship to grind credits with, the Tirpitz absolutely would be your go-to ship. So this second match is something a little bit different in that, it's one of the new maps that came in with the last patch. And also this one is maybe going to demonstrate some of the fragility of this ship, even when you're top tier. And that's one of the overall issues with that Citadel being as it is. As I've said, it almost at times feels like you're playing a cruiser, in that you really have to carefully shepherd your hit points. And that is up to and including sometimes withholding fire, because you'll be spotted if you fire, and sometimes it's just safer to hold fire, and of course that impacts your damage output and that impacts your profitability. So that's not a great quality for a premium battleship, but it's not the only one that has that, of course. I keep going back to the Dunkirk, but the Dunkirk is the same. Even with the heel, it's a squashy ship. The fact that this is just much more stealthy than the Dunkirk means it's a hell of a lot easier to stealth up again. There was actually one game with a Kutuzov division, two Kutuzovs who were just perma-smoking each other and also sitting behind an island to boot. They were complaining that I was OP because I kept disappearing at around 12 kilometers in between firing my guns, and that allowed me to reposition and be in places they weren't expecting me to be. And I just found it funny that the fact that I was stealthing up so they couldn't spam me over and over with HE was, them considering me to be OP. Yeah, okay, sure. So that is a nice feature, but it's nothing that the North Carolina can't do as well and better. So it's not exactly unique to this ship. So we're starting off with, I'd only played this map a couple of times, so I decided to press around this side rather than just go into the cap willy-nilly, which would give me rather bad angles to the southwest in terms of enemy battleships maybe being able to hit me. So I decided to take the more cautious approach, and actually had this smoke cloud dropped for me, which was rather nice. But I can't maybe hang around here too long because there's always the possibility of an enemy destroyer popping up. But also, it's not exactly an optimal position to stop and fire from. There's only that Pensacola to really shoot at right now. And I've already said how troll these guns can be. So firing at this kind of range, it's extremely dicey. I did have some games where I got a decent number of citadels, and other games where I just had to keep firing over and over and over, and I'd get maybe 110k damage out of it, which is, you know, that's not bad for a tier 8 battleship. It's okay, but I feel like I have to work harder at it than even something like the Tirpitz. And the Tirpitz isn't known for its accuracy, but the Tirpitz can just afford to get that much more up close and personal. And of course, it's got that sting in the tail with torpedoes. And that's actually, like with some of the premiums we've had, like even comparing this to the Missouri, a lot of the premiums have had gimmicks of some kind, and this doesn't. Although you could say this has, I don't know, the inverse of a gimmick, in that it's got that citadel. And it's actually going to be unique for the American battleships in having that, or the high tier ones anyway, having that above waterline citadel, because as I've said, the Montana and the Missouri and the Iowa are all getting buffed in that regard, and that's just going to leave the South Dakota sitting on its own. I did it again there, didn't I? I know it's the South Dakota, the Missouri, not the Missouri. Wow, I'm doing well. Alabama, there we go. I'm just going to randomly name some US states now. I think it's the Hawaii class battleship. Yes, good grief. Anyway. Oh, America. I mean, I know you like naming things after states, but it does get a bit, you know, hard to keep track of sometimes because you have so many states. So, I decided it was time to move into the cap at this point because the Bismarck had pushed in with his hydro. I have to be a lot less wary about destroyers, of course, but that's at the point where this Otago decided to push around, and it would be really nice at this range if I could get some citadels. So I'm going to try and get my guns around, see if I can't do that. But this other battleship, this Colorado, I think it is, it's a little hard to tell on the preview screen. He is probably not going to last. Oh, there we go, there's a citadel. So there we go. Oh, Nagato. Okay, I saw it had a 0. An O! Wow, that's embarrassing. That's more embarrassing than usual. Getting my O's and my zeros mixed up. Yes, let's move swiftly on. So, fingers crossed, might be able to kill this completely broadside Otago, and I do. But I've taken a bit of damage myself in the meantime. And that's one of the things I haven't really touched on, is the vulnerability to HE damage as well. I don't know that this necessarily feels like it burns any more readily than other battleships, but I felt like HE was doing quite a lot of damage, and that's sort of noticeable in this particular match. And I don't know if that was just me having a couple of unlucky matches, but there are a couple of times when HE really did seem to be doing a number on me, and not even just like IFHE equipped ships, but battleship HE as well. Anyway, that was the time I intimated to earlier, where I decided to, you know, I was going to take the hit, so I might as well take it on the belt. And as you can see, that was what, 7k damage. So that mitigation is that's a really nice feature of this ship. So, in terms of the game, this is turning out to be a very awkward match. I think it's partly compounded by the fact this is a new map and everyone's sort of slightly flailing around and not quite knowing what to do. If we can get another cap point, I think that's going to be very useful at this stage, because A looks very vulnerable. Their remaining destroyer appears to be up there. A carrier is likely to get spotted, and yes, he's only a tier 6 carrier, so it's not that big of a loss, but it's still a carrier's worth of victory points, so we don't want to lose that, really. Oh, that was a nasty hit. That might have been a citadel, in fact. That was, what, 12k? So, yeah, I thought I was unspotted through the smoke and it was safe to push south, but no, sadly not. So, yeah, the carrier's vulnerable, and then there's a pair of battleships up there as well, which are facing against the Bismarck, I think that is. I think it was Bismarck they had left at this point. Now, fortunately for us, however, their carrier had not really moved at all, and so I've run smack, even bang into him, and taken off quite a nice chunk of his health. And even if he had planes left, which I'm not sure he does, I would not have to worry about them because he's been incredibly unlucky enough to get into a tier 8 game in a tier 6 carrier. So yeah, that probably wouldn't really work out for him. This is going to be one of those ships where a lot of the time, even in games with carriers, having that good AA isn't necessarily going to be that useful, just because people will go, oh, that's got good AA, I won't bother going near that then, up until the point when they really need to. But, you know, against a tier 6 carrier, it doesn't really matter that much. So he's down, and I can cap safely. I could maybe have just gone into the cap circle quicker here and let the Budioni finish off the carrier, and that was really, I mean, I look back at that and I think that was just sheer greed, pure and simple, to get the kill and that extra bit of damage. And it's not like getting a tier 6 carrier kill is going to be worth that much XP, but there it is. So looking at the score counter, you know, that maybe seems like not the best decision right now, because they are ahead of us, and having that cap taken into our possession just a little bit sooner could have been, you know, useful, vital, maybe even in some alternate timeline, but it's not going to work out that way, fortunately, because the remaining enemies are all relatively low health. Now, I don't have a lot left myself, and this is the battleship firing HE at me that seems to do so much damage, by the way. I don't know if I happened to meet a battleship driver that was using IFHE or something like that, but either way, yeah. So the fact that it's a slow-moving Colorado is obviously a lot easier to compensate for with these slow-moving AP shells, but he is angled relatively well. I mean, he's actually showing a bit too much side armor here, but his HE is really doing a number on me. So he's set another fire, and you know, battleship HE does set a lot of fires, but he then gets a third fire going, at which point I think, yeah, okay, I'd actually better repair that. So I've got a heal going, but even despite that, he's continuing to hit me with HE. You can see the Budioni is trailing close behind me and just using me as a riot shield, which is fair enough. Meanwhile, well, the last two other remaining ships, I mean, this Colorado's just about done for. Yeah, they die pretty much at the same instance. So the Hatsuharu kills the Bismarck with a detonation, and the remaining destroyer, whatever that was, that gets taken out by gunfire, I think. So it was a bit of luck that Bismarck dying to a detonation, because I would not fancy going toe-to-toe with him in the state that I'm in at this point. I do have heals left, but not a lot of hit points that I can get back. So yeah, I wouldn't have liked that game to have gone on for that much longer. So again, around the 100k damage mark, and again, a reasonable score and a reasonable profit. And for all these games, you know, I was using full premium consumables as well, so bear that in mind. So not quite as much score that time, but still 2.1k, base XP is pretty respectable, 4 kills. I'm trying to think if there was any point where I could have had a Kraken in that one, but probably not. So yeah, that was an okay game. I had lots of okay games. And even in the okay games, I still felt like this was quite a fragile ship. There was one match where it wasn't even a Yamato, it was a top tier game. I got caught unawares by an enemy battleship who had my broadside, and I went from like 55k down to about 5,000 health, all in the space of around about a second. So that must have been multiple Citadel hits, or, you know, multiple Citadels and penetrations. Yeah, if you get caught unawares like that, it's like playing a cruiser. You can just get deleted so quickly. So before we wrap things up, I'll take a look at the armor viewer, and we can peer into the heart of the matter. What makes the Alabama feel quite so fragile. Now, for reference, I'm going to look at also the Iowa and the North Carolina very quickly. So if we strip away the outer layers, we can see the North Carolina basically flush with the waterline. So getting Citadel hits not that easy. And you've also got reasonably sturdy fore and aft Citadel armor. So that's fine. The Iowa, by comparison, yeah, it sticks up rather far, and the fore and aft armor, well, you've got a bit of 287mm there, but then it's actually weaker lower down, and it's even worse in the rear view. Although I'm not sure, like the armor viewer doesn't always necessarily show everything, because I have heard tell that with the Alabama in the armor viewer there is a slight bug. It's missing a plate that it should be showing. So yeah, anyway, the Iowa, it's quite fragile when you're broadside, but as I've said, this is changing. It's actually going to lower down to the waterline, or I assume down to the waterline. It's getting lowered anyway. So onto the Alabama itself, and the barbette and turret face, you know, it's all reasonably tough and it all looks quite good, but the armor profile is a lot like the Iowa. You've got this tougher strip here, and then a considerably weaker strip actually. There wasn't that big of a gap between the upper and lower fore armor. Yeah, 287 down to 216, and then that's 156. So that's maybe one of the reasons why it's so vulnerable to things like the Yamato, which can just overmatch basically any angle, and it's not like it's then got that much armor to stop it. If it doesn't bounce off this inner part, then it's just going to plunge straight through that. The deck armor is also that 154, and the rear again shows as being quite weak, but I did hear anecdotally that there might be an armor plate that the armor viewer is not showing, but having said that, you know, the Iowa looks exactly the same, so it's possible that there's extra armor there that's not in the viewer, but either way, just showing your rear to anybody is probably not a good idea, because that's going to make you very, very vulnerable to citadels from the rear especially. So you don't really want that. You always just want to have everybody facing your front at all times, ideally, and of course in World of Warships that's not always possible. So yeah, it's this that causes all the problems, and I really hope that they buff it, because otherwise it's a little hard to recommend this ship, especially when you've got the Iowa, the Missouri rather, which is getting buffed, and the Tirpitz, which is just so much tougher and more flexible than this is. And if it didn't have that Citadel sticking so far up, this would be quite a nice, well-rounded premium battleship. It's not one like, you know, the Mutsu or the Dunkirk or I don't know, the Texas or whatever, that relies on gimmickry more or less. It would just feel like a very nice, well-rounded Tier 8 battleship, where you're trading some accuracy for better close-in performance. But that's just wiped away by that Citadel. So what you're left with is something that feels far more fragile than it should, and for its fragility then doesn't seem to really have much back in the way of you know, accuracy or hit points or anything like that. So it feels like a complete mismatch in terms of its characteristics, and I think that's basically what most other YouTubers have gone ahead and said as well. It feels like the flavor that they want this to have is it's conflicting with itself. It's contradictory bits of characteristics that are then just making the whole thing weaker than it should be. So it's a bit disappointing, and I can only hope that it will be buffed. It's not like with a waterline Citadel it would be completely overpowered or anything like that. You know, we're still not talking the turtleback armor of the Tirpitz and the Bismarck. It would just bring it in line with the North Carolina, and the North Carolina is a reasonably tough ship, but it's not like it's invincible, and this won't be invincible either. It's just at the moment it's far too vincible. That's a word, right? That must be a word. So there it is, the Alabama. Overall, my recommendation for it can only be lukewarm at best. for basically all the reasons I've already gone over. So yeah, fingers crossed, because it could be quite a nice ship, and let's hope at some point in the future it will be a nice ship, because at the moment it's just missing a bit too much. So hopefully you found this preview useful. If you have, you can hit the like button, you can leave your comments below, you can sub to my channel if you haven't already, and as always, stay tuned for more.